When this happened, I had just gotten a new job in a corporate building in downtown Dallas. It was a simple administrative position for a technology company that occupied several floors of the building. Since the department I worked in handled internal support, part of the team worked night shifts. I was one of the people responsible for covering the evening hours, usually from 6 in the evening until almost midnight. During the day, the building was full of people, but after 8 at night, almost everyone would leave and the floors became nearly empty. At first, that didn't bother me much. I worked in an office on the 12th floor, and on most nights there were maybe 2 or 3 other people in different departments still working. On the ground floor of the building, there was the main lobby, where a night security guard always sat behind a desk near the entrance. He was an older man, probably in his 50s or 60s, with the kind of calm posture of someone who had been working in the same place for a long time. Every night when I entered or left the building, I would pass by him. At first, he seemed like just a friendly security guard doing his job. He always greeted people entering the building, asked how the work night was going, and sometimes made small talk when I passed through the lobby on my way out. Since the building was almost empty during the night shift, it was normal for him to try to talk a bit with the few people who were still there. I didn't think anything was strange during the first few weeks, but after some time I began to notice that he seemed to know more about my routine than I remembered telling him. One night, for example, when I passed through the lobby to buy something from the coffee machine, he casually commented that I usually left my office around 8:30 to get a snack. That caught me a little off guard because I had never mentioned that time to him. I assumed he had probably just noticed through the cameras or something like that, so I didn't think too much about it at the time. A few days later, something similar happened again. I was leaving the building for a few minutes to grab something from my car that I had forgotten in the back seat. When I passed through the lobby, he commented that I usually parked on the left side of the underground parking lot, near column number 4. That caught my attention a bit more because I really did always park in that exact spot, but I didn't remember ever mentioning that to him. I laughed a little awkwardly and asked how he knew that. He answered casually that he sometimes checked the parking lot cameras to make sure everything was normal. At that moment, the explanation seemed reasonable. After all, part of his job was to monitor the building and the surrounding areas. Even so, I began to notice that he observed much more than just the main entrance. As the weeks passed, he started mentioning other small details that made me increasingly uncomfortable. One night, while I was passing through the lobby to go to the elevator, he commented that I usually worked alone on the 12th floor after 10 at night because most of the staff had already gone home. That made me stop for a second because he said it in a very specific way, as if he were tracking exactly when the floor became empty. I tried to keep the conversation light and just said something like, "Yeah, it's usually pretty quiet up there at night." He simply nodded and smiled calmly as he always did. Nothing in his tone of voice sounded aggressive or threatening, but the more he mentioned those things, the more I felt like he was paying too much attention to me. One night in particular stayed very clear in my mind. The building was even quieter than usual because almost everyone had left early that day. I went down to the lobby around 9 at night to get something from the coffee machine. When I passed by the security desk, he said something that made me stop immediately. He mentioned very casually that the parking lot cameras sometimes stopped recording for a few minutes during the early morning hours. He said it almost like he was commenting on some minor technical detail about the building. I asked if that wasn't a security problem, and he just shrugged and said it happened occasionally when the system had to restart. At that moment, I felt a strange discomfort that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it while looking directly at me. It felt like he was telling me something that I was supposed to understand, without him needing to explain it completely. That same night, I decided to finish my work a little earlier than usual. There wasn't much left to do in the office, and I was already feeling tired. It was around 10:15 when I shut down my computer, grabbed my bag, and walked to the elevator on the 12th floor. The building seemed even emptier than usual. The hallway lights were on, but there was no sound coming from any other offices. When the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened, the lobby looked almost exactly the same as always. The security guard was still sitting behind the desk near the main entrance. He looked at me as I stepped out of the elevator and commented that I was leaving earlier than usual that night. That immediately caught my attention. Because I had not mentioned anything about leaving early, I simply replied that the work had finished earlier than expected and kept walking toward the exit. When I stepped out toward the parking area, the first thing I noticed was how dark it was outside. Most of the lighting came from a few posts scattered around the area, but they didn't cover the entire underground parking lot evenly. Some sections were well lit, while others were almost completely in shadow. My car was parked where it always was, near the column where I usually left it. As I walked in that direction, already holding my car keys in my hand, I noticed someone standing near the driver's door. For a moment, I thought it might be another employee leaving at the same time, but as I got closer, I immediately recognized the silhouette. It was the building's security guard. He was standing exactly next to the driver's door of my car. For a moment, I stopped walking, trying to understand what he was doing there. He saw me at that moment and raised one hand in a calm gesture, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. When I finally got close enough, I asked what he was doing in the parking lot. He calmly replied that he was just doing a patrol. What I could never understand was why, in an almost empty parking lot, he was standing exactly next to the driver's door of my car, waiting in the exact spot where I would have to stand to get into it. Story 2. When this happened, I was 20 years old and working the overnight shift at a small convenience store in a quiet residential neighborhood in rural Tennessee. It wasn't a big city where there's always movement, but it also wasn't completely isolated. The store sat on a corner near a state road that crossed through the town. During the day, the place was fairly busy, but after 11 at night, the flow of customers dropped a lot. My shift usually started at 10 at night and went until 6 in the morning, but the store closed to the public around 2:30. After that, I stayed inside organizing stock, cleaning the counter, and waiting until it was time to leave. Most nights I worked completely alone after midnight. The manager left around 11, and the rest of the night it was just me at the register. At first that made me a little nervous, but over time I got used to it. The neighborhood was considered safe, and most of the people who came in during the early morning hours were local residents stopping by to buy coffee, gas, or a quick snack. The nights were usually quiet, with long stretches where no one came into the store. A few weeks after I started working that shift, I began to notice a customer who appeared fairly often close to closing time. The first time he came in, I didn't think anything was strange. He was a man who looked like he was in his mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. He came into the store about 10 minutes before closing, walked slowly through the aisles, and looked at some shelves for a while. But after a few minutes, I realized he wasn't picking up anything to buy. He was simply walking through the store, looking at the shelves, reading labels, passing through the beverage aisle, and then returning toward the counter. At one point, he asked me if the store sold a certain type of energy drink that was already sitting on the shelf right behind him. I answered by pointing to the refrigerator, and he just nodded and kept walking through the store. In the following days, he started showing up more often, almost always at the same time, a few minutes before I closed the store to customers. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, maybe someone who had the habit of stopping by late at night after work. But over time, I realized he almost never bought anything. He would come in, walk through the aisles, look at the shelves for a few minutes, and then simply leave. On some of those nights, he tried to start conversations with me at the counter. The questions were never really about products in the store. Sometimes he asked whether business was usually slow at that hour, or if many people showed up after midnight. Other times, he asked whether the store always stayed open until 2:30, or if the hours changed during the week. At first, I answered politely, the way I would with any customer, but I started noticing that his questions were always very vague and almost always related to how the store operated. After a few weeks, it started to feel like more than just coincidence. He almost always showed up during the last part of my shift, when the store was emptier and when I was alone at the register. Sometimes he would come in 15 minutes before closing and slowly walk through the aisles, almost as if he were trying to spend as much time as possible inside before I had to lock the door. His behavior was never openly aggressive, but there was something about the way he observed the place that made me uncomfortable. He looked very carefully at the inside of the store, the counter, the front door, and even the small hallway that led to the storage room in the back. Sometimes he would walk to the drink refrigerator, open the door, look inside for a few seconds and close it again without taking anything. Then he would walk back through the snack and candy aisle, always without bringing anything to the register. One night in particular was when the situation started to worry me for real. It was almost 2:20 in the morning, only a few minutes before I was going to close the store. I had already started putting some things away behind the counter when he walked in through the front door again. The bell above the door rang and I recognized him immediately. He walked through the store the same way he always did, slowly passing through the aisles and looking at the shelves. After a few minutes, he came to the counter and stood there with one hand resting on the metal surface of the register. For several seconds, he looked toward the area behind me, where the door to the small office of the store was located. Then he asked me a question that immediately made me fully alert. He asked directly what time I usually left work after the store closed. I answered vaguely, saying only that I still had some tasks to finish after closing and that sometimes it took me a while before leaving. I didn't want to give a specific time. He simply nodded as if that answer was enough and stood there for a few seconds looking around the store again. Then he walked to the front door and left without buying anything at all, just like he had done other times. A few minutes later, I closed the store the way I always did. I turned off part of the lights inside, locked the front door, and started finishing the last tasks behind the counter. Normally, I stayed there another 15 or 20 minutes organizing the register and finishing small chores before leaving. That night, however, I kept thinking about the question he had asked. It felt too specific to be just casual curiosity from a customer. When I finally finished organizing the register and turned off the last lights in the store, I grabbed my bag and walked to the front glass door to leave. Before unlocking it, I looked outside at the street the way I always did. The store was located on a relatively quiet corner, and at that hour, almost no cars passed by. That's when I saw a vehicle parked across the street. The car was stopped near the curb with the engine running. I could see a little smoke coming from the exhaust because of the cold that night. At first, I thought it might be someone waiting to buy gas or maybe a driver stopped while checking their phone. But as I looked more carefully into the car, I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. The silhouette of the driver was the same as the man who had been inside the store just a few minutes earlier. He was sitting there across the street, waiting. I stood there inside the store for a few seconds looking through the glass door, trying to understand if he was really waiting there, or if it was just a coincidence. The car remained exactly in the same spot, with the engine running and the lights off. The street at that hour was completely silent. No other cars passing by, no one walking along the sidewalk. The longer I looked at the vehicle, the more certain I became that it was him. The shape of the head, the cap, the posture in the driver's seat. Everything looked like the same man who had been in the store minutes earlier, asking what time I got off work. That made me immediately step back inside the store and lock the door again. I knew it wasn't a good idea to go outside alone at that moment, so I stayed inside, with almost all the lights in the store turned off, occasionally looking through the window to see if the car was still there, and it remained there. The engine stayed running and the vehicle didn't move. He stayed parked across the street for several minutes as if he were waiting for me to come out. I ended up calling a coworker who sometimes passed near the store around that time. I quickly explained the situation and asked him to meet me there before I left. About 20 minutes later, when his car finally appeared on the street and parked in front of the store, I looked again across the road. The man's car was still there, but a few seconds after seeing the other vehicle stop in front of the store, he finally drove away. Story 3. When this happened, I had just been hired by a large logistics company that had several offices across the United States. I was going to work in a smaller office in downtown Chicago, but before officially starting, we had to attend a mandatory training at a regional company building located in another neighborhood of the city. The training lasted 2 days and brought together new employees from different departments. It was basically a room full of people who had started at the company during the same week. On the first day, we were directed to a conference room on the 3rd floor of the building. There were maybe 15 or 20 people seated at tables arranged in a U-shape, all with laptops and training materials. The instructor responsible for the course was a middle-aged man who introduced himself as someone who had been working at the company for many years, training new employees. At first, everything seemed completely normal. He explained company policies, talked about internal procedures, and asked a few general questions so that people could introduce themselves. During the first part of the training, he began asking each person to briefly introduce themselves to the group. Nothing unusual: name, department, which city they came from, and how long they had been in Chicago. When it was each person's turn to speak, he would make a few comments or ask additional questions. At first, this seemed like just an attempt to make the environment more informal, the way many instructors do during corporate training sessions. But after several introductions, I began to notice that some of his questions were becoming a little too personal. For example, when one of the participants mentioned that she had just moved to the city, he asked whether she lived alone or shared an apartment with someone. When another man said he had worked night shifts at another job before joining the company, the instructor asked if he usually returned home very late at night. That started to seem strange because it had nothing to do with the content of the training. As the training continued through the morning, his questions became even more specific. Whenever someone mentioned something about work routines or schedules, he seemed interested in learning more details than necessary. At one point, he asked one of the women whether she usually worked late at the office or if she normally left on time. At another moment, he asked a man whether he lived near the building or if he had to drive to get to work. The way he asked the questions also started to make me uncomfortable. He wasn't aggressive or rude, but he seemed far too attentive to information that had nothing to do with the training itself. I remember looking around the room at one point and noticing that some other people also seemed a little confused by it. Even so, no one said anything because everyone just wanted to finish the course and officially start their jobs. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I tried to keep my answers as simple as possible. I said my name, that I had just been hired to work at the downtown office, and that I had moved to Chicago a few months earlier. As soon as I finished speaking, he did the same thing he had done with others. He began asking additional questions. First, he asked whether I lived near the office or if I needed to take transportation every day. Then he asked if I shared an apartment with someone or if I lived alone. That caught me a little off guard because I didn't expect those kinds of questions during a professional training session. I answered vaguely, saying only that I lived in an apartment near the train line and that I usually went to work by public transportation. After I responded, he simply nodded and wrote something down in a notebook that was on his desk. That caught my attention because he hadn't taken notes when other people were speaking. The rest of the training continued normally for several hours, with slide presentations and explanations about the company's systems. Even so, I couldn't help noticing that from time to time he looked at certain people in the room more carefully than others. At the end of the second day, when the training was finishing, he said that anyone who wanted could take one of his personal business cards in case they had questions in the future about company procedures. That didn't seem strange at first, since many instructors do that. But instead of leaving the cards on the table for anyone to take, he started walking around the room handing cards directly to certain people. I noticed that he wasn't giving cards to everyone. He walked past some people without saying anything, and stopped only beside a few specific participants. When he reached my table, he placed a card on the desk and said something like, "In case you need help when you start at the new office." His tone of voice sounded normal, but it still made me feel slightly uncomfortable. When I quickly looked around the room, I noticed that he had done the same thing with maybe 4 or 5 people in total. The rest of the group simply left the room without receiving anything. At the time, I thought that maybe they were just people he believed might have more questions since they were new to the company. I took the card mostly out of politeness rather than interest and put it in my bag along with the other training papers. A few days later, I officially started working at the office where I had actually been hired, which was in downtown Chicago. It was a large building with several different companies occupying separate floors. The routine quickly became normal, arriving in the morning, working in the office with the rest of the team, and leaving at the end of the day. The training already felt like something distant, just part of the hiring process. It was almost a week later that something strange happened. I was in the office near the end of the workday and went over to one of the large windows that faced the street to quickly talk on the phone. While I was standing there looking down, I noticed someone standing on the opposite side of the street near the sidewalk across from the building. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Chicago is a busy city, and it's normal to see people standing on the sidewalk waiting for transportation or looking at their phones. But after a few seconds, I noticed something familiar about the posture of that person. It was the same man who had conducted the training. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence. I assumed he might simply be passing through the area or waiting for someone in another building. Even so, I kept looking through the window for a few seconds to make sure it was really him. The distance wasn't very far, and it was possible to clearly recognize his face and the way he dressed. It was the same man who had spent 2 full days leading the training. What began to make me uncomfortable was realizing that he didn't seem to be waiting for anyone or trying to enter any building. He was simply standing on the sidewalk across the street, looking in the direction of the building where I worked. He didn't appear to be looking at his phone or talking to anyone. He was just standing there watching the building. I stepped away from the window at that moment because I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. When I returned a few seconds later to look again, he was still in the same place. And from the position of his head, it seemed like he was looking directly at the section of the building where the windows of our office were located. That's when I realized something that still makes me uncomfortable when I think about it. That man did not work in that building. He had only conducted the training at another company office in a completely different neighborhood of the city. And yet he was standing there across the street watching the building where I had just started working. Story 4. When this happened, I had just accepted a temporary job at a large logistics warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was one of those companies that process online shopping orders, so the place operated practically 24 hours a day. Since I needed money quickly at the time, I ended up taking the overnight shift, which ran roughly from midnight until close to 7 in the morning. The warehouse was enormous, one of those industrial buildings with long aisles of tall shelves and different areas separated by sectors. During the overnight shift, the number of employees was much smaller than during the day. Maybe 15 or 20 people spread throughout that huge space. Each person was responsible for a specific sector, usually walking through the aisles, scanning boxes, and picking orders. Because of that, it was common to go long periods without seeing anyone. Sometimes you could spend half an hour working in an aisle without crossing paths with another employee. During the first few nights, everything seemed normal. I was still learning the warehouse routine, trying to understand the layout of the aisles and how the order system worked. Sometimes I passed other employees pushing carts or using handheld scanners, but almost no one talked much during the shift. Most people simply did their work and moved on to the next aisle. It was during one of those first weeks that I started noticing a particular coworker more often than normal. At the time, I didn't know his name, but I recognized the uniform and badge as belonging to another warehouse employee. What caught my attention was that he seemed to show up repeatedly in the same aisles where I was working, even when I had already moved to another part of the sector. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Since the warehouse was large and the sectors sometimes overlapped a little, it wasn't impossible that two people could end up working in nearby areas during the same night. Even so, I started noticing that he appeared in places where, according to the sector map we had received during training, he wasn't supposed to be assigned. One night, I was working in a storage aisle located deep in the back of the warehouse, a more isolated area where almost no one passed by. I was scanning some boxes when I looked to the other side of the aisle and saw him standing there, looking at the shelves as if he were checking something. He didn't appear to be using a scanner or pushing an order cart, which was strange for someone on duty. He stayed there for a few seconds looking at the shelves as if searching for a specific item. Then he began walking slowly down the aisle and disappeared around the corner between the storage rows. At that moment, I assumed he was probably just moving to another area of the warehouse. But about 20 minutes later, when I was already working in another aisle closer to the central area, I saw the same guy again. This time he was on the other side of the row of shelves, walking slowly between the aisles. What caught my attention was that he seemed to notice me before I even looked directly at him. As soon as our eyes met, he turned his head away as if he were just passing through by chance. That gave me a strange feeling, but I still tried to convince myself that I was probably imagining things because of the fatigue from working the overnight shift. As the nights went by, it started happening more frequently. I would move to another aisle to collect a different batch of boxes, and sometime later he would appear in that same area. Sometimes he would simply walk past. Other times he would stand for a few seconds looking at the shelves or at the floor, as if trying to appear busy. The strange thing was that I almost never saw him actually working the way the other employees did. His behavior was also different from the rest of the team. Most people on the overnight shift at least exchanged a quick greeting when passing someone. Just a simple good evening or something like that. But that guy almost never said anything. He just walked through the aisles in silence and kept moving whenever he realized someone was nearby. One particular night made me pay closer attention to him. I was near the shipping area organizing some boxes when he appeared again in the aisle next to mine. This time he didn't just walk past like he usually did. Instead, he stopped near one of the shelves and stayed there for a few seconds looking in my direction. After a moment, he walked a few steps toward where I was and spoke to me for the first time. His voice was calm and low, almost casual. He asked if I always worked that shift or if I sometimes worked during the day as well. I answered that I usually only worked the overnight shift because that was what was available when I was hired. Then he asked another question that caught my attention even more. He asked if I usually left alone after the shift ended. At the time, I answered simply, saying that normally yes, that I just grabbed my things from my locker and walked to the parking lot like everyone else. His question seemed a bit random inside a warehouse where dozens of people finished their shifts at the same time, but it still stuck in my mind. He just nodded after I answered, as if he had received the information he wanted. After that, he didn't say anything else. He simply turned his body, walked down the aisle, and disappeared between the shelves of the next sector. I stood there for a few seconds looking in the direction he had gone, trying to understand why that conversation had made me uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly what he said, but the way he asked it, as if he were just confirming a routine. The rest of the shift went relatively normally after that. I continued working in the storage aisles, scanning boxes and preparing orders until the end of the shift finally arrived. When the clock marked the end of the shift, the few people who were working in that part of the warehouse started walking toward the locker rooms to collect their belongings. After grabbing my backpack from my locker, I walked with the others to the side exit of the warehouse that led to the employee parking lot. It was still completely dark outside because the sun only began rising later at that time of year. The parking lot was large, lit only by a few light poles scattered between the rows of cars. Some people walked together talking, others headed straight to their vehicles. I walked toward my car, which was parked near one of the areas farther from the exit gate. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed something strange between two rows of vehicles. Someone was standing there. At first I thought it was just another employee looking for their car in the dark, but as I got closer, I immediately recognized the silhouette. It was the same coworker from the overnight shift who had been appearing in the warehouse aisles. He wasn't walking toward any car. He was simply standing between the vehicles, looking in the direction of the building's exit, watching who came out first into the parking lot. Story 5. When this happened, I was working at a small accounting office in a 3-story commercial building in a relatively quiet neighborhood in Phoenix. It wasn't a large building, just a few suites occupied by small businesses such as medical offices, law firms, and administrative services. Our office was on the 2nd floor, and normally 4 people worked there during the day. But on some afternoons during the week, I ended up staying alone for a few hours, while the rest of the team went out for meetings or external appointments. That particular afternoon, the office was completely silent. I was finishing some reports on the computer while answering occasional calls from clients. The hallway on our floor was almost empty, and from time to time I could hear distant footsteps from someone walking past another office. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I heard a light knock on the glass door of our reception area. When I looked at the door, I saw a man standing in the hallway outside. He was wearing a dark polo shirt, jeans, and carrying a small tool bag over his shoulder, like someone who works with technical maintenance. As soon as I opened the door, he said he was a technician from the internet company and that he needed to check the office router because a possible issue with the connection in that area of the building had been reported. At first, that sounded plausible. Internet companies sometimes run checks or maintenance when they detect instability in the network. Even so, something immediately caught my attention. I didn't remember anyone in the office requesting technical support that day. Normally, when that happens, the manager or someone from the team lets the rest of the office know that a technician will be coming by. Still, I didn't want to be rude or immediately assume something was wrong. I asked if he knew which room the network equipment was in, thinking he might just be looking for directions. Before I even finished the sentence, he pointed down the internal hallway of the office and said something like, "I think it's in that little room near the file cabinet, right?" That surprised me a bit because he was correct. The company's small router and modem were located in a storage room at the back of the office, near a filing cabinet. It was a place visitors normally didn't know about because it was outside the reception area. I hadn't mentioned that to him, but he seemed to know exactly where to go. He walked into the office with a confidence that felt a little strange. He didn't wait for me to guide him down the hallway. He simply started walking in that direction, as if he already knew the layout of the place. I followed a few steps behind him, still trying to decide whether that was normal or not. When we reached the small storage room, he opened the door without hesitation and crouched near the shelf where the modem and router were located. He began handling the cables and looking at the devices the way any technician would. For several minutes he stayed there silently, checking the connections while I stood at the doorway watching. After a few minutes he stood up and said that everything appeared to be working normally. He mentioned something about checking the building's main connection, and that he might return another day if the provider detected a real problem with the line. His tone was calm and professional, exactly like someone simply completing a routine technical service. Even so, I still had that feeling that something wasn't right. Before he left, I asked which company exactly he worked for, thinking I might recognize the name of our internet provider. He quickly replied with the name of a well-known telecommunications company and said he had been servicing several buildings in the area that day. After that, he walked back down the hallway toward the reception door. I followed him to the exit while he put a few tools back into his bag. Before leaving, he glanced briefly around the inside of the office as if he were simply taking one more look at the place, and then said that any future problems would probably be resolved remotely. When he stepped out into the building hallway, I closed the door and went back to my desk. At first, I tried to continue working normally, but that feeling of doubt wouldn't leave my mind. Something about that visit felt out of place. It wasn't just the fact that I didn't remember requesting maintenance. It was also the way he seemed to know exactly where the network equipment was inside the office. After thinking about it for a few minutes, I decided to do something simple to clear up the doubt. I picked up the phone from my desk and called the support line for the company that provided our internet service. I quickly explained that a technician had come by the office to check the router and asked if there was an open service request for our address. The person on the other end of the line asked for a few seconds to check the system. While I waited, I found myself staring at the glass reception door, remembering how calmly that man had walked into the office and gone straight to the room where the equipment was. A few moments later, the support agent returned to the call. He said there was no record of any technical service request for our building that day. I confirmed the address again to make sure there had been no mistake. The agent checked once more and repeated the same information. No technician from the company had been sent to the building that afternoon. That was the moment I realized something that made me truly uncomfortable. I had let a completely unknown man walk into the office, and he seemed to know exactly where everything was inside. Story 6. When this happened, I was working at a small digital marketing agency in downtown Seattle. The office wasn't very large, maybe around 12 people in total, all working in an open space with a few meeting rooms along the sides. It was one of those typical startup environments. Desks close together, whiteboards on the walls, and people spending the entire day in front of computers discussing campaigns and deadlines. A few months before that, a coworker named Aaron had started behaving strangely at work. At first, it seemed like normal stress from someone dealing with too many projects at the same time. But as the weeks went by, he began having frequent arguments with other members of the team. Sometimes he raised his voice during meetings or made uncomfortable comments about coworkers during internal conversations. Things started to get worse in the following weeks. Aaron began having more frequent disagreements with the team manager and with some people from the creative department. In some meetings, he would interrupt coworkers aggressively or insist on arguing about decisions that had already been made. In a small environment like that, any conflict quickly became noticeable to everyone. Eventually, the situation reached a point where the company's leadership decided he could no longer continue working there. The dismissal happened on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't in the room when it occurred, but everyone noticed that something had happened because he left the office shortly afterward, accompanied by someone from the administrative department. A few hours later, the manager briefly gathered us to say that Aaron was no longer part of the team and that his projects would be redistributed. After that day, the office routine returned to normal relatively quickly. In small companies, things have to keep moving, so the projects he had been handling were distributed among the rest of the team. Some people commented about the strange behavior he had been showing in the previous weeks, but soon the subject stopped being mentioned so often. We were also informed that his access to the company's internal systems had been removed immediately after his termination. That included his corporate email, access to the file server, and all the platforms we use to manage campaigns. This is a standard procedure in technology and marketing companies, especially when someone leaves under tense circumstances. The idea is to avoid any issues involving data or clients. For about a week, everything seemed completely normal, until one of the team members received an unexpected email. The first email appeared in the inbox of a coworker who worked at the desk next to mine. He opened the message during the morning and a few seconds later, called two people over to look at his computer screen. I walked over as well out of curiosity. The message had been sent from Aaron's old corporate email account. At first, we thought it might just be some automatic email that had been scheduled before he was fired. But when we started reading the content, we realized that wasn't the case. The message mentioned very specific details about things that had happened inside the office the day before. Conversations that had taken place between two members of the team while they were sitting near the window. That immediately left everyone confused. The first reaction was to think that maybe someone was playing a prank using an old email address, or that the system hadn't been completely deactivated yet. But when we looked more closely at the message, we noticed something strange. The email described in detail a conversation that had happened in the office the previous afternoon. It wasn't something that had taken place during an official meeting or in any company communication channel. It was just an informal conversation between two coworkers near the office kitchen. The kind of conversation that normally no one outside would hear or even know had happened. And yet the email mentioned exactly what had been said. At first we thought it might just be a coincidence or someone trying to scare people in the office. But the next day it happened again. This time another person on the team received a message from the same email account belonging to Aaron. Just like the first one, the message mentioned very specific details about something that had happened in the office the day before. It described a private conversation that had taken place inside one of the meeting rooms between two company managers. That conversation had not been sent through email or recorded in any team messaging platform. Even so, the text of the message described quite accurately what had been discussed inside that room. After that, the situation quickly became the main topic around the office. Some people became genuinely concerned because it no longer seemed like a coincidence. The messages kept arriving to different members of the team, always sent from Aaron's old email account. And the content of those messages always had something in common. Very specific details about things that had happened inside the office after he had been fired. In one of the emails, he mentioned comments that had been made during lunch in the small office kitchen. In another, he described exactly who had stayed late working on a particular project the night before. None of that information was written in reports or internal messages. They were simply things that someone physically present in the office could have seen or heard. The company's management quickly became aware of what was happening. The first step was contacting the IT department responsible for managing the company's email system. They checked the access records of Aaron's old account again. According to them, the account access had been completely removed on the same day he was fired. That meant that, in theory, no one should have been able to log into that account to send messages, and yet the emails kept arriving. The IT department analyzed the message headers to determine where the emails were being sent from. The messages truly appeared to be coming from the same corporate account he had used while working there. Meanwhile, the entire team began noticing another detail that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The emails always mentioned very recent events from inside the office, conversations that had taken place just a few hours earlier, small details that were not recorded anywhere. After a few days, the conclusion began to seem unavoidable to everyone there. If someone was writing those emails with such precise details about what was happening inside the office, then that person was probably inside the office again at some point, and no one on the team had seen Aaron return to the building since the day he was fired. Story 7. When this happened, I was 22 years old and had just started working the overnight shift at a small roadside hotel in rural New Mexico. It was one of those typical hotels near state highways, mostly used by truck drivers, people traveling long distances, or families who need to stop for a few hours of sleep before continuing their trip. The nearest town was almost 20 minutes away by car, so at night the surrounding area was practically deserted. I had just finished community college and was trying to save money while figuring out what to do with my life. A friend of my mother mentioned that the hotel needed someone to work the front desk overnight. The shift was from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Most people hate that schedule, but for me it seemed perfect. It was quiet, paid reasonably well, and there was almost never any activity after 2 in the morning. Normally, there were only 2 people in the building at that hour. Me at the front desk and a housekeeper responsible for preparing empty rooms for the next day. The building had 2 floors, long hallways, and a large parking lot in front. Behind the reception counter, there was a small monitor connected to the security cameras showing the hallways, the parking lot, and the staircases. During the first few weeks, everything felt extremely routine. I checked in the occasional late guest, answered the phone now and then, and spent most of the night watching the cameras or using the computer. On the night this happened, it was particularly quiet. It was winter, and there was that dry desert cold that settles in at night. Outside, you could hear the wind moving across the parking lot and rattling the metal panels of the hotel sign. Inside the reception area, the heater made a constant, slightly irregular humming sound. I remember it must have been around 3 in the morning because the last guest had arrived almost an hour earlier. After that, the building became completely silent. I was sitting behind the counter casually watching the cameras on the small monitor, more out of habit than necessity. The hallways were empty, as they usually are at that time. One of the camera views showed the second-floor hallway, illuminated by those bright white lights hotels usually use. That was when I noticed someone walking down that hallway. At first, I didn't think anything of it. My first assumption was that it was just a guest going to get ice or something like that. But when the person passed under one of the lights, I realized he was wearing a hotel uniform. A light-colored shirt with the logo embroidered on the chest and dark pants, exactly like the maintenance staff uniform. That immediately made me frown because I knew who was working that night, and no maintenance employees were scheduled for that shift. I leaned forward in my chair to look more closely at the monitor, trying to see if I was misinterpreting the image. Sometimes the cameras in that hotel had poor resolution, especially in areas farther from the internal router. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became that it really was someone wearing the hotel's standard employee uniform. The man walked down the hallway at a calm pace without rushing, as if he were simply going from one part of the building to another. He didn't look like a lost guest or someone searching for a specific room. He looked like he knew exactly where he was going. I spent a few seconds trying to remember if any employee had mentioned that someone from maintenance might come during the night to check something. But I was certain that hadn't happened. The manager always warned us whenever someone unfamiliar would be in the building during the night shift. Besides, the only other person working there at that moment was the housekeeper, a woman named Rosa who was almost 50 years old and usually stayed on the first floor preparing a few rooms. I kept watching the camera as the man walked along the second-floor hallway until he disappeared from the camera's field of view. That was when I felt that small uneasiness begin to form in the pit of my stomach. Nothing was obviously wrong yet, but something clearly didn't add up. Since we had internal radios for communication between staff, I grabbed mine from beside the reception computer. I pressed the side button and spoke in a casual tone, trying not to sound concerned. I asked if anyone was on the second floor at that moment. My intention was to see if Rosa would answer, saying she had gone upstairs to check a room. The radio made that short burst of static typical before transmitting, but then it went completely silent. No response. I waited a few seconds and tried again, calling her by name. Still nothing. That started to make me more alert. Rosa always answered the radio, even if it was just to say she was busy. I stared at the monitor again, expecting to see the man appear in another hallway camera or on the stairwell cameras. But for several seconds, there was no one anywhere. The hallway was empty again, bright and silent as if no one had ever walked through it. That was when the uncomfortable doubt started creeping in. Part of me thought maybe he was a new employee I hadn't met yet. But another part of me remembered that there shouldn't have been anyone else in that building besides me and Rosa. I kept watching the monitor longer than I normally would. When you work the overnight shift, you learn to ignore a lot of small things so you don't become paranoid about every detail. But at that moment, I couldn't just go back to the computer and forget about it. I kept switching between the different camera feeds, trying to find the man again somewhere in the hallways or staircases. The images cycled from one camera to another. The first floor hallway empty, the emergency staircase motionless, the ice machine area completely still. Everything looked too normal. I thought about going up to the second floor to check in person, but there was a problem with that. The reception desk couldn't be left completely unattended for long. If a guest arrived or needed something, someone had to be there. So I decided to try the radio one more time. I pressed the button and called Rosa again, asking if she was on the second floor. This time I waited even longer. All I heard was the same faint static of the open frequency and then silence. That started to truly bother me. Rosa normally carried the radio clipped to the pocket of her apron. Even if she was busy in a room, she usually responded. Then one of the cameras automatically switched on the monitor, as the system did every few seconds. The screen changed from the first floor hallway to the outside parking lot camera. And that was when I saw the same man again. He was outside now, standing in the parking lot. At first, it took me a second to process what I was seeing. He wasn't walking or looking at his phone like someone who had stepped outside to smoke or grab something from a car. He was simply standing beside a vehicle. As my eyes adjusted to the image, I realized which vehicle it was. It was my car, an old sedan that I always parked in the same spot along the side of the building close to one of the cameras. The man was standing less than a meter from the driver's door. His posture was strange. He was slightly leaning forward as if looking inside the car through the window. Even with the low-quality camera, it was clear he was still wearing the hotel uniform. The light-colored shirt stood out against the darkness of the parking lot. And at that moment, I felt something very clearly. That man was not there by accident. When I realized he was standing next to my car, my first instinct was to immediately look toward the glass front door of the reception area, as if somehow I might see him from there. But the side parking lot wasn't visible from that position. The camera was practically the only way to see that side of the building. I looked back at the monitor and watched the image more carefully. The man remained exactly where he was, looking into the car. He didn't seem to be trying to open the door or touching the vehicle, just observing. That made it even stranger, because most people who approach a car in a parking lot are clearly trying to get something or get inside, but he stood completely still. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. It wasn't immediate fear of something happening, but that unmistakable feeling that someone was paying attention to you in a way they shouldn't. I tried zooming in on the camera image using the computer system, but the quality didn't improve much. Even so, it was clear that his head was slightly tilted, like someone trying to see better through the glass. For a few seconds, I wondered if he might be searching for something specific inside the car. My mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe he thought it belonged to a guest. Maybe he was checking something related to maintenance. But none of those ideas really made sense. After almost a minute standing there, the man finally moved. He slowly straightened up and looked around the parking lot, as if checking whether anyone was watching. It was a simple movement, but it made my entire body tense in the chair. That didn't look like the behavior of an employee doing something normal. It looked like someone being overly cautious. Then he took a few slow steps around the car, passing behind it and moving to the passenger side. At no point did he look directly at the camera. That also caught my attention, because people who work in hotels usually know where the cameras are. After circling the entire car, he stopped for a few seconds and looked toward the building. Not directly toward the reception area, but toward the side where there was an access door used by employees. That door was a few meters outside the main field of view of the camera. I suddenly felt a strong urge to get up and go check if that door was locked. But at the same time, I didn't want to take my eyes off the monitor, because it was the only way to know where the man was. Then he began slowly walking toward that side of the building, and disappeared from the camera's field of view. The moment he vanished from the screen, I felt that sudden urgency that makes you stand up before you've even finished deciding what to do. My first reflex was to glance again at the main glass entrance of the reception area, just to make sure it was locked like it always was during the night. After that, I walked quickly to the small side door behind the counter that led to an internal hallway used by staff. That door connected to another exit that led to the side of the building, exactly where I had seen the man disappear on camera. Before opening it, I paused for a moment with my hand on the handle, trying to hear any sound from the other side. The building was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the ceiling. No footsteps, no doors opening. Nothing. Even so, my heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. I opened the door just a few centimeters and looked down the hallway. The lighting there was dimmer, a line of spaced-out bulbs that left some areas partially shadowed. The hallway was empty. No sign of anyone walking there. I slowly walked to the end of the hallway and checked the side door that led to the parking lot. It was closed and locked from the inside, exactly as it should have been. That confused me even more. If the man had come from the parking lot to that area, he wouldn't have been able to enter through that door without a key or employee card. And if he had already been inside the building before that, how had he suddenly appeared on the parking lot camera just moments later? I stood there for a few seconds, looking through the small rectangular window in the door, trying to see something outside. But that part of the parking lot was outside the reach of the main lighting, so all I could see were shadows and faint reflections of light on the asphalt. No one was visible. After checking the handle once more to be sure it was truly locked, I walked back down the hallway toward reception. The strange feeling in my stomach had grown stronger. It wasn't panic yet, but that clear sense that something in that place wasn't aligning with logic. When I returned behind the front desk, the first thing I did was immediately look at the camera monitor. I expected to see the man again somewhere in the parking lot, or perhaps appearing at one of the building entrances. But the screens showed only the same silent images as before. The second-floor hallway was empty. The emergency staircase had no movement. The front parking lot camera showed only 2 parked trucks and the hotel sign lighting up part of the asphalt. The side camera where I had seen my car was quiet now too. My car remained exactly where it always was, alone, with a thin layer of desert dust settled on the hood, no one nearby. I stared at that camera for almost a full minute, waiting for him to reappear. Part of me began wondering if I had misinterpreted something. Maybe the man had simply walked away outside the camera's field of view. Maybe it had been a guest wearing clothing similar to a uniform. But even as I tried to rationalize it, one detail wouldn't leave my mind: the way he had looked inside my car. Not like someone curious, but like someone checking something. Then I finally heard the radio make a small clicking sound. I grabbed it quickly, thinking Rosa had finally responded to the calls I made earlier. Her voice came through a few seconds later, slightly muffled by static. She asked if I had called for her earlier. I said yes and asked where she had been. She replied that she had been in the laundry room at the end of the first floor organizing clean sheets and hadn't heard the radio because she had left it on a table while working. That gave me a small sense of relief, at least explaining why she hadn't responded. Still, I quickly told her what I had seen on the cameras. I said that a man wearing a uniform had appeared in the second-floor hallway and later in the parking lot next to my car. There were a few seconds of silence on the other end of the radio. When Rosa answered, her voice sounded confused. She said she hadn't gone up to the second floor that night and hadn't seen any other employee in the building since the beginning of the shift. After saying that, Rosa left the laundry room and walked to the reception area. I heard her footsteps in the hallway before I even saw her appear at the edge of the doorway. She looked a little concerned, though not exactly frightened yet. When she reached the counter, I turned the monitor slightly so she could see the cameras with me. I explained again what I had seen a few minutes earlier. The man walking in the second-floor hallway wearing a uniform and then appearing in the parking lot next to my car. Rosa stared at the screen silently for a few seconds, as if trying to determine whether it made sense. Then she asked if I was sure it was a hotel uniform. I said yes, that it looked exactly like the one used by the maintenance staff. She frowned and said that none of the maintenance employees worked that shift, and that they normally only came in the morning. We spent a few more seconds watching the screens, waiting to see if anything different would appear. But everything remained still. That started making the atmosphere in the reception area feel strange. Not panic, but that kind of discomfort that arises when 2 people realize something doesn't quite fit together. Then I had the idea to open the hotel's internal system on the computer. The program we used at reception had a basic record of employees, including current staff and some former ones who had been registered years earlier. I started searching through the list of maintenance employees, trying to see if any name or photo matched the man I had seen on the camera. Rosa stood beside me watching the screen as I scrolled through the profiles. Most of the photos were old and slightly blurry, taken for employee badges years earlier. After several minutes, we couldn't find anyone who clearly resembled the man from the camera. Rosa then suggested that maybe the manager would know if any former employee still had a uniform or access to the building. Since the manager lived in the nearby town and sometimes answered calls even during the night in emergencies, I decided to call him. The phone rang a few times before he answered, clearly with the voice of someone who had just woken up. I quickly explained what I had seen on the cameras and mentioned the uniform. There was a pause on the other end of the line while he tried to understand the situation. When he finally responded, he said something that made the atmosphere at the reception desk feel even heavier. According to him, no one wearing that uniform had worked at the hotel in years.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.